I recently saw a new science fiction movie, I Am Mother. This movie takes place after a major event that wiped out all the people in the world. Before the event, 63,000 human embryos were hidden in a sheltered place underground, and a robot takes one of these embryos and starts to grow it. The story in the movie doesn't have much to do with what I'm going to tell next, but just this opening sequence raised some questions in my mind. What kind of people would babies born in an environment completely closed to the outside world become? If it were possible to make those babies walk in such an environment without any human contact, how would they communicate with each other? What language would they speak among themselves? Of course, this is not the first time these questions have occurred to me. Many times throughout history, newborn babies have been isolated from everyone else and experimented on. These attempts are called language deprivation experiments because they prevent them from communicating with the outside world in any language, written or spoken. The goal is to find the source of the language we speak, and even deeper, to understand the foundations of human nature. Of course, isolating babies to understand such a thing is highly unethical. That's why cultural historians like Roger and Shattuck prefer to give such experiments another name. Forbidden experiment. The historian Herodotus gives us the first example of forbidden experiments in written sources. Around 600 BC, the Egyptian pharaoh Psamtik ordered 2 newborn babies to be taken from their parents and given to a shepherd. The shepherd was strictly forbidden to speak to these babies. However, the babies developed a language among themselves, and the first word they uttered in this new language they invented was because. This word did not exist in the Egyptian language. It was the word for bread in the language spoken by the Phrygians who lived in Anatolia long before those years. This is why the Egyptians of that period believed that the source of themselves and their language was Phrygia. About 1800 years later, in the 13th century, Frederick II conducted another experiment in which babies separated from their families were raised with minimal human interaction. Only their basic needs were met, but they were never spoken to. If there is such a thing as a mother tongue, one wonders which language would be the mother tongue of these babies. Shall I tell you the predictions they made? They thought that those babies would speak either Hebrew, Greek, Latin, or Arabic, respectively. These are the languages of scriptures or ancient texts. So as you can easily deduce from their guesses, the real purpose of the second frickwell was to discover what language Adam and Eve spoke. Salim Binet, the historian who chronicled these events, does not tell us what language those babies learned to speak, but he writes in great detail about the cruelty of the people who carried out these experiments on them. In later centuries, there were other children who had to grow up in isolation, naturally, if not through similar experiments. Wild children growing up alone in nature, away from people. Because they had no human contact, they never developed the kind of language we speak. Found in Ukraine, this girl named Oksana was raised with dogs and can communicate in their language. To date, other babies have been found raised not only by dogs, but also by bears, sheep, cows, goats, and even ostriches. These babies naturally developed behaviors similar to those of the animals they grew up with. After joining humans, they learned many things, but most of them never developed language skills. There's another way of being isolated that is forced by birth: deafness. It has been observed that deaf children try to develop their own language when they are surrounded by people who do not know sign language. For example, these Nicaraguan children were never communicated with until 1980. They were isolated from birth because of their health. After the Nicaraguan Revolution, they were brought together in the country's first school for the deaf. They wanted to teach them sign language so they could express themselves better. In a sense, they brought together under the same roof 100 different babies who until then had lived in their own rooms, isolated from the outside world. But because they were no longer babies but children, they could not realize this goal. They could not teach them sign language. Instead, the children invented a new sign language using hand gestures and facial expression. This time, those who wanted to understand them called language experts to try to decipher this new language. According to linguists, this new language developed by the children is surprisingly complex and very rich. No voice is actually needed for communication. Communication is a common heritage of humanity. It is an inevitable consequence of being human. Today, we still don't know exactly how languages emerged and how they evolved into what they are today. But one thing we do know is that speaking is the most fundamental way of sharing the knowledge we have. We feed on knowledge we have. We feed on knowledge and we feel the need to speak in order to share what we have learned. We invented 6,300 different languages just for that. At the beginning of the video, I told you about a movie called I Am Mother, the story of a child raised by a robot. The robot in the movie tries to communicate with the child like a mother. So it talks to him just like a human being. The child doesn't need to invent a different language. He tries to learn about life by talking to a robot. History has always wondered what happens when you lock babies up and isolate them from the outside world. There have been dozens of unethical experiments on this subject. All this to find the source of what we call mother tongue. To understand what it is to be human at an even deeper level. Maybe the way to do this is to isolate ourselves from time to time, not others. Maybe that way we start to think more. We talk to the books we read, so we develop our own language. I am mother means I am mother, so we find our mother tongue. It is not the language spoken by the Phrygians who once lived in Anatolia, as the Egyptian pharaoh suspected. It is a language spoken by the philosopher Immanuel Kant. He once said that all language is the envy of thought. Thinking is a human being talking to himself. This must be the highest level of language a human being can develop.